All right, I want to do a program that calculates the average of user-entered scores using a sentinel loop. So we're going to write a program to ask the user to enter their scores, and it will output the number of scores and their average score. The user will indicate there are no more scores by entering a -1, and this is what we call the sentinel. So I'm going to jump over to Eclipse and sort of set up the class, and then we'll come back and do the pseudocode in a second. So I need a new Java project, chapter 5. No module. And then inside here, I need a new class. And we'll call it calculate average. And that's my block commenting in. Program will use a sentinel loop to get user entered scores. We'll output the number of scores along with the average. Average score. Okay, so jump back over and do a little bit of work on the logic first. Come over here. So what do we need to do? We need to do something until the user enters a -1. So what we need to make sure is we have something the user is going to enter first. So the first thing we need to do is get the score from the user. Let's go with green. So our first thing that we need to do is get the score. You know, we could just have a method for this. And if we're going to call a method, let's have it return some value score. Okay. So, and that method wouldn't necessarily need any parameters. We could put the scanner within the method. So then we want to run a loop, and that loop will run, it'll say while the score does not equal -1. Well, what would we want to do here? We would want to, let me just kind of write it out in words, increase the count, how many scores we have, and then we would want to increase the total, which is the sum of all, the sum of all the scores. So why isn't it letting me erase? And it's now functioning. 1 second. All right, increase the count, and then increase the total. And then we want to run this loop again, but in order to run this loop again, we got to get another score. So again, I need to call this function getScore and save it in the value score. So call that function getScore. And then that's going to be our while loop. As long as that score that it gets is not -1, it will increase the count, increase the total, and get another score. As soon as that's a -1, then it won't run the loop again. It'll exit the loop, in which case we can, output our results. We could have a method here that calculates the average, but essentially we just need to output those results. And that, let's look at what it wants there. We want to average the number of scores, so that's going to be the count, and the average score. So we're going to need the count and the total. So let's send up here the count and the total. And I just want to comment here. Notice we're getting the score here, and we're having to get it again inside the loop. This is often the case with a while loop, and this step out in front of it is what we call priming the loop. We're going to prime the loop. We need to have a score to begin with before we can enter the loop. And then if that score is not -1, we'll enter the loop, and then we'll get another score within the loop to allow the loop to continue. Unlike definite loops, while loops much more frequently will tend to run forever if we make a mistake. So you want to be careful of that, and you can just quit out of the program, and sometimes it's not going to give you an error, it's just going to keep running. Okay, so let's go try to code this. Maybe I'll keep that logic somewhere handy. Down here when I'm running something in Eclipse, there's a little red stop box here that you can terminate the code with if you're stuck in an infinite loop. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need is this method called getScore. So for now, I'm just going to set one up. I'm going to go, let's make our scores integers. Integer score equals getScore. And we'll set up that method down here. Public static void, not void, integer getScore. And it's wanting us to return an integer, so we're just going to return. For now, let's just return -1. Just set up the logic. I'm going to need a scanner, so import java.awt everything. And then let's write this getStore method. So scanner console. We could use the word input if we wanted. New scanner system.in. I'm sorry, I need to not report AWT, but yeah, I think the utilities. Sorry. AWT is for the graphics. Okay, so now I'm going to return here console.next integer. But before I do that, I want to prompt the user to enter something. So system.out, the print statement, enter an integer, or enter an integer score. And then I'll put in parentheses -1 to quit. Colon and a space, unquote. So that's a decent prompt for a sentinel loop. It's telling them what kind of score you want and also what the value they need to enter in to quit. And then, let's just print the score out here. And just make sure that our code is working. So I haven't done any sentinel loop or anything. I just writing the score to get an input. So 50 should should print a 50. Okay. Obviously, if I enter -1, it's not going to do anything because There's nothing to quit out of. Now, currently, so this function has no preconditions, but the post condition here is that user will enter an integer. Well, I guess that's not the post condition is that this function will return an integer. So right now, it's not a post condition. The user will enter an integer or program crashes or method crashes. Returns an integer. That's the post condition. I don't really need it here. So what do I mean by that? If we run it again and I enter in John, I get an error message. The program crashes. So we can fix that in a few minutes. So we can make that method robust so that it will only return an integer. It will continue to run that code until it gets an integer. So we'll do that in a second. But before we do that, let's go back to our pseudocode here. Get the score while the score does not equal -1, increase the count, increase the total, and get another score. So notice I have a count and a total that I need to increase. So those need to be declared before the loop. Integer count. Well, it's starting off, how many things do we have in the beginning? 0. Integer total. How many things? What's the total value in the beginning? 0. Put a comment in there, initialize our variables. I guess in a sense we're declaring and initializing them. And then we're going to say while score does not equal -1, because score is an integer, it's a primitive. We're not using the dot equals. We're using the not equals to, which is the exclamation point followed by an equal sign. We can use that with any primitive. So integers, doubles, characters, and booleans. While the score does not equal -1, increase the count and increase the total. So count increases by 1, so we could say count equals count plus 1. That's one way to do it. Or we've been doing this in our loops, count plus plus. We'll also increase it by 1. And then total needs to equal total plus score. And I can simplify that by writing total plus equals score. Add the score to the total each time. Okay? And then so notice if I run this right now. Let's enter my 50 in, return. And it looks like nothing else is happening, but the count is increasing, the total is increasing, and it's just keep running this loop forever. So I'm going to hit stop. I want you to be able to see that, so I'm going to print those out. I'll just print them on one line with a space between them. And it's going to happen really fast, so let's enter in an 8. Whoa, so you can see the count is increasing, the total is increasing, and it's increasing forever unless we run out of space in our computer or we hit stop. Okay, and the reason it's doing that is because I never got another score. So of course the score wasn't -1. I just kept increasing the count and increasing the total. And right here I need to get another score. So score equals get score. And then maybe outside of this while loop, let's print those values. The count and the total. I need to not just print the word, but I need to add the word count in here. And the total, I want to add in the total here. This is a temporary, these are temporary print statements that we're using to test our score, our code. Run it. So I'll just enter two things in. Let's go with 80 and 70. So the total should be 150. Oh, but it didn't. Then I got to hit -1 to quit. Count 2, total 150. Notice it doesn't count the -1. We don't want it to. We don't want that to be added into the total. So that worked. Now I can get rid of these print statements. Look back at our pseudocode. We want to output the result with the count and the total as parameters. Now, in the outputting of the results, the total is not something I'm going to output, but I need it to compute the average. So I'm getting an error because I haven't defined that method yet. So this has nothing to return. And it's getting two integer values in. Integer, let's just go with count and integer total. We use the same names. There's so few variables in this code that I don't think it's going to be confusing. And then let's define a double. Average is going to equal the total. It's a little weird if I go total divided by count. I'm worried this is going to take an integer value. Integer division rather than double division. So let's just check that. We'll enter 3 scores that add up to 100. And that way the average will be 33.333333. And let's see what happens if I run that. So I'm going to enter in 20 and 50, that's 70, and 30, that's 100. And then I'll enter in -1. So see how that converted it to 33? Because, I mean, it converted it to a double, 33.0, but this should really be 33.33333. So the reason it's not is because these total and count here are both integers. So we need to make one of them a double. Unless we don't care, let's make one of them a double. So let's go back up to total and make total a double. And then in here, we're not passing in an integer, we're passing in a double. And notice if I do that same computation again, 20, 50, 30, followed by a -1, I now have a double here, which is what I wanted. Okay. So we're back here in output results, and I'm going to do a print formatting statement. So system.out.printf. So we're going to, in quotes here, put your average, or the average of the 3. So we're going to put the count in here, %d of the average of the 3 scores is %. It's a float. I want to go to precision of 2, so 0.2f, and then a period after it. And I also want a new line character at the end of that, so \n. And then in here, we'll put the count and the average as our parameters. Getting a little practice with the print formatting. Try it again. 20, 50, that's 70, 30, -1. The average of the three scores is 33.33. Okay, so our main is working fine, where the logic of the loop is happening in main, and the incrementing of the total and the count. The ancillary functions of get score and output results are functioning, but get score is not very robust, because if we enter the wrong thing in, the program will crash. So we want to change it to always post condition always returns runs and always returns an integer. Continues to ask for input until integer is entered. So how do we do that? We need the console, and then we need another while loop here. Maybe, let's see. Let's go back over here and let's look at how we could do that in our pseudocode. If we were looking at a method to get input, we would need to prompt the user. And then we want to use the scanner look ahead. So we would say something like, while it's not console.hasNext integer. So the look ahead is has, put the word has in front of it, so hasNext integer. So if it has an integer, this will be false. So when it's not an integer, you give them an error message, and then you reprompt. So we have the prompt already written. Enter an integer -1 to quit. We're going to need that line of code twice. So, one thing we could do is we could define a variable string called prompt, and just let that string equal this code here. Copy that and paste it in up here. And now the print statement gets a little easier. We can just print the prompt here. And I probably, let's see, so if this is going to run again, well, let's see what happens. Notice that prompt does not have a new line character at the end, so we're going to need a new line character somewhere. So here's where I'm going to put my loop. While it's not true that the console.hasNext integer. While the next thing is not an integer, I need to tell them there's an error. Let's make it a print line statement. And actually, invalid entry. Invalid entry. Let's try again. And I don't need to have that capitalized. Invalid entry, please try again. Or maybe we just have a comma there. Invalid entry, please try again. And then we need to tip the prompt. Now, there's an issue here in that the prompt doesn't have a new line character in it. So when we run this, enter an integer, -1 to quit. Let's enter in, oh, I didn't. Yeah, that's right. So then if they enter an integer in, say 50, then it's going to get out of that while loop and it's going to return that integer down here in the console.nextInteger. So it's still working. But now if they enter something that's not an integer, look what happens. It's just running forever. And so what's happening here is that, well, a couple things. We want, let's put an empty print line statement here. That's not what's wrong. But if I put an empty print line statement, that's going to get below that line. Then it'll say invalid entry, please try again. Then it prints the prompt. But before it does that stuff, or after it does that stuff, we now need to get rid of the negative, the bad input that was there. So right here, we just need to say console.next. And whatever they input will now be read in, and it's ready to have them input something else. And actually, I think we want to put that before the prompt. Let's cut that out of there. Let's put that in there first. Let's look at this logic. So if the next thing they entered is not an integer, read it in, print a line, tell them they have invalid input, tell them to try again. And now it's going to look ahead and say, have they entered an integer? If they haven't, if they enter something else in, it's going to read it in, print an empty line, to tell them it's invalid and to enter it again, and keep going, hopefully. And then when it's correct, it's going to return that integer. So we enter 50, it works. We enter 46, it works. We enter John, it says invalid entry, please try again. Oh, I actually wanted to enter 80, and then 98, and then -5. So again, it accepted that -5. So notice that you can have a score of -5, but you can't have a score of -1. So we might not want that -5 score to be valid, because if -5 is valid, then probably -1 is also valid. So we might go back to our prompt. We might say enter a positive integer score, and then you say -1 to quit. But really, what we do is we quit while the score is greater than or equal to 0. So the sentinel is -1, but really if they enter any negative score now, it'll quit. Kind of cheating. So you could say, instead of saying -1 to quit, you could say any negative number to quit. But we're catching that sort of with this idea of the positive input. So always returns an in. So then, well, I don't know, sort of 6 in one, half dozen the other. Whether we allow those negative scores. It depends on the program that we're writing. What's the conditions by which we're doing it? 98, 89, 92. Let's see if that averages above 95, which I need to get an A. A 4.0, excuse me, because you can get down to 90 to get an A. 93, so not quite. I need a little higher if I want to get a 4.0. Okay, so I think that's it for this example. I went on a little longer than I had anticipated. There's a lot of good stuff in here. So we're using initializing the variables. We're using a getScore function twice, initially to prime the loop. And then we have the loop running. It's a sentinel loop. So maybe I say that here, loop runs until negative value entered. mean, that's clear from the loop itself, but whatever. Clean this space up. We got our pre and post condition on get score. We've got a prompt, a console, and then we print the prompt. While the console does not have an integer coming, read that value in. That's an important step. And then get another value. And then return that. As soon as it is an integer, return it and the output results function using printf. So I'll pause at this level for a second. If you want to pause the video to get that part. And then I'll scroll down. There's the top part. And I'll scroll down and you can pause for the second.